Hi, so ICE has been all over the news this week, but there are some important aspects that I think have been less well covered, but really matter. And then I'm also going to go through how Trump has targeted Canada recently, and then some more concerted attacks on the environment and health. So firstly, on ICE and surveillance. So while the ICE surge in Minnesota was supposed to be focused on serious offenders, there are various sources of evidence from photographs, videos, and internal documents that actually paint a really different picture. And what it shows is that ICE agents have been leaning really heavily on things like biometric surveillance and this kind of interconnected databases that they've built over the previous year or years. And the Associated Press basically said that this highlighted how ICE has built this sprawling digital surveillance system, and that's how it's kind of tackling its immigration crackdown. And then on the same day, the New York Times reported how ICE is using facial recognition, social media monitoring, and other kind of technical tools to track protesters as well as undocumented immigrants. So, for instance, they highlighted the case of one American citizen who was stopped in her car by an ICE agent, and he then kind of greeted her by name and then told her that she had been identified through facial recognition. And then 3 days later, she received an email from Homeland Security basically saying that her global entry and TSA travel privileges had been revoked. And they didn't offer any kind of explanation, but the timing seems a little bit more than coincidental. Wired then reported that ICE has formally asked various companies to provide information about their kind of commercial big data and ad tech products, that they wanted to know whether they would directly support investigation activities. So essentially what they're trying to do is expand the kind of technical tools that they have available to use for either law enforcement and surveillance. And then even as this kind of surveillance expansion has happened, the administration has sought to cut funding for body cams. So when body cams are worn by agents, in some ways that they are protective of people that they arrest or detain because they provide evidence of what happened. And there's been a lot of kind of increased urgency to increase the amount of body cams worn by ICE agents, given what's been going on in Minnesota, particularly the death of 2 American citizens. But the Department for Homeland Security has proposed reducing spending on body cams in its initial budget proposal. Then there's ICE and the rule of law. So last week, 16 people were charged in Minnesota with assaulting immigration agents during a protest. And the US Attorney General Pam Bondi basically posted their photos on social media. And the judge in the case said she was deeply disturbed by this, and that basically images of people who are presumed innocent until proven guilty should not be shared on social media. And the judge went on to say, this conduct is not something that the court condones. And then on the same day, another federal judge in Minnesota said that ICE was flouting the law by ignoring dozens of federal court orders just during January 2026. So he cited at least 96 federal court orders that he said ICE has violated across 74 cases. And he wrote in his ruling, this list should give pause to anyone, no matter his or her political beliefs, who cares about the rule of law, and that ICE has likely violated more court orders in January 2026 than some federal agencies have violated in their entire existence. And then just finally, Bloomberg's been reporting about some ICE commercial activities. So basically, ICE are definitely planning to continue expanding their activities this year, and they've been buying mega warehouse detention centers across the US. So the cost for acquiring just 2 warehouses alone was $172 million, and a third in El Paso, Texas, would be among the largest jails of its kind with well over 8,000 beds. And then on to Canada. So this week, Trump turned his attention back to Canada. So first, he was upset that Canada's been exploring trade deals with China, and he threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Canada if it makes a trade deal with China, even though literally a week earlier, Trump said he thought it would be a good thing. And then not done with tariffs, a few days later, Trump threatened to slap 50% tariffs on all aircraft made in Canada until Canadian regulators certify several American-produced aircraft. And Trump also threatened to decertify Canadian-produced Bombardier Global Express business jets, and that itself would have quite severe implications for many US airlines. And then finally, the Financial Times reported that the Trump administration has held covert meetings with fringe separatists in Canada's province of Alberta, which has a lot of oil. So leaders of the Alberta Prosperity Project, which is a group of far-right separatists who want the Western province to become independent, met US State Department officials in Washington at least 3 times since April last year. So this is really another attempt to kind of undermine Canadian internal stability and cohesion. So lots of quite worrying things have happened to undermine public health this week. So NBC News reported that dozens of Centers for Disease Control databases, so CDC databases, are not being updated. So most of these out-of-date ones are related to public health. So for instance, databases tracking uptake of annual vaccines or databases tracking hospitalization for various illnesses. And because they're not being up to date, it really does reduce the ability of public health officials to take action to protect the health of Americans because the current situation is less well known. And then Health Secretary RFK Jr. Has continued to weaken American expert health advice to align with his own unevidenced beliefs. So there's a panel that helps the federal government set priorities for autism research and social services. And that has been overhauled. And basically what he's done is he's installed several members who have said that vaccines can cause autism, despite decades of research saying there is no link between vaccines and autism. And staying on vaccines, last summer, RFK Jr. targeted the preservative thimerosal in vaccines and basically banned it from vaccines available in the US. And that was done without a rigorous scientific process. So there is no evidence linking thimerosal to harm. So there's no scientific reason to ban it. So in fact, there are research studies involving millions of people showing that thimerosal is not linked to autism. So the Trump administration has now told global vaccine group Gavi that it has to phase out vaccines containing thimerosal as a condition for the US giving funding to Gavi, and that is a significant amount of money. Now, thimerosal containing vaccines are still used in over 120 countries, and the World Health Organization have estimated that immunization with these vaccines currently protects almost 2/3 of all infants and children against 4 potential deadly diseases. So you can see how either Gavi's going to end up with a lot less money to carry out its life-saving programs, or many of the vaccines that are currently used are going to have to be withdrawn. And who knows if these children will still get vaccinated against these diseases. So it has massive consequences. And then in more international news, the State Department has ordered US missions to review all aid programs to ensure that they're not funding groups that are working on family planning, diversity, or what the Trump administration calls gender ideology. So the policy has existed for a while, but it was previously focused purely on abortion. And now it's also barring funding of groups that work on DEI, gender and transgender rights. So kind of thinking now about the environment. So last week I was saying that the US has finally now officially exited the World Health Organization. And this time what's happened is that they've now officially exited the Paris Climate Agreement for the second time. And now basically that means that the US is the only country to have withdrawn from the pact, and the only other countries that never signed it to begin with are Iran, Libya and Yemen. So it's not going to stop global climate efforts, of course it isn't, but it is going to make it harder to achieve them. Staying on climate change, a federal judge ruled that the Energy Department violated the law when Energy Secretary Chris Wright handpicked 5 researchers who reject the scientific consensus on climate change to work in secret on a sweeping government report on global warming that was released last summer. So not only was that unlawful, but it's also important to note that exactly the same 5 researchers have just been picked in December to write the next instalment of the US National Climate Assessment, and that is America's preeminent report on global warming. And then the Department of Energy also overhauled a set of nuclear safety directives, and basically they shared them with the companies that it regulates, but they didn't make those new rules available to the public. And the changes affect various aspects of reactor operations, including safety systems, environmental protection, site security, accident investigations, and so on. And the idea was that they wanted to accelerate development of a new generation of nuclear reactor designs. So have safety directives been significantly weakened? I mean, who knows, because they've not made it public. But one way that we can see that Americans have become less safe was from a court filing against the Trump administration last month about FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So that's the agency that warns the American public about upcoming disasters such as storms, fires and floods, and then also helps communities recover afterwards. And really what the lawsuit said was that FEMA management had been told to plan for a 50% staffing cut, which will obviously significantly impact its ability to keep Americans safe. So for details on all these actions and more, visit the TrumpActionTracker.info.